Hey AP Economics students, time for another free response question from an old AP exam. Today we're looking at AP Macro from 2019, which had two exams that were released by AP Central, and this is Set 2. So here's what we have. It says, assume the economy of Artland is currently operating above full employment. So, as usual on macro, most of the time it's going to be something about the ADAS model, and they are going to, in some cryptic way, tell you the economy is either in long-run equilibrium, it's in recession, or it's in an inflationary gap. It's going to be one of these three, and this one decides to see if you can figure out that if you're above full employment, you must have a hot economy, and you're at risk of an inflationary gap. So it's going to be this one. Hot economy, you're above full employment. All right, so we don't have to worry about these two. And then let's see what else they say. Number one says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply. So basically just draw what this little light sketch is here. So we're going to draw that and put our labels. So done this several times, so this one should go pretty well. So we're going to get our axes. Take time to draw these nicely with a straight edge. And we're going to have our intersection, our equilibrium is going to be to the right, so I'm going to move the LROS a little bit more to the left. And then we'll have our intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply on the hot side. Alright, so we have a nice inflationary gap there. And now we will fill in everything. AD. SROS. Here is the LROS. Here is our price level axis. And here is our quantity of real GDP. And let's see what else they want us to say. So draw a correctly labeled graph. We have short run, long run, aggregate demand. And the current equilibrium output and price level is Y sub 1 and PL sub 1. So here's our current spot. We will dot down. And we will say Y sub 1, and we will go over from here. Okay, and we have our price level sub 1. Okay, got everything we need there. So that is, that's 1, and then for 2, full employment is Y sub F. So full employment is where the LROS is. There we go. So there is A, 1 and 2, got it done. All right, part B says, assume the central bank or the Fed and the government do not take any policy actions to close the output gap. So we go a little Hayekian Austrian school, just leave it alone. We do very little here. We don't intervene. We let the economy self-correct. So that's the approach, and it says, on your graph, show how the economy is going to adjust in the long run and put your new equilibrium as PL sub 2. Well, we know that if you intervene in an economy, and I'm hoping that you got this straight from before, but if you choose to intervene in the economy, intervening in the economy will completely affect your aggregate demand curve. But if you allow the economy to self-correct, self-correcting affects the aggregate supply curve. All right, so whenever you leave it alone, it's going to be this curve shifting. If you intervene, you're shifting this one. So let's look at this. We have an inflationary gap. If you wanted to be a fiscal policy person, you could cut government spending, get that back. You could tax people to get it back. You want a monetary policy, intervene it. Raise interest rates, that'll get it back. Raise the discount rate, raise the reserve ratio, but you're attacking the aggregate demand. That's an interventionist approach to an economy. If you're a self-correcting approach to an economy, you just say, just supply will take care of itself by the businesses. So what happens in this situation when you're in inflation, you're driving up price level in a hot economy. And eventually, if price level gets a little too heated, resource prices, labor, everything gets too expensive, and what winds up happening is SROS decreases, and we'll bring it back. So this would be S Ross prime, and we're going to show that this is going this way. This is decreasing. And we need to label our new price level. Well, our new price level here, according to the problem, we're going to put in PL2. And this actually goes over to here, and this is a little bit weird, but with our correction here, we actually wind up having, I guess, or did they only want our price level changed? Oh yes, it wasn't the quantity, it was just the price level. Okay, so we don't need to have that highlighted here. Okay, so part B was we adjusted on the graph, and then part 2 says explain the cause of the adjustment shown in B1. So our adjustment, we'll go ahead and put this up here. So our explanation here for this is going to be an increase in price level results in an increase in resource prices of labor and capital. Resulting in a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. Okay, things got more expensive, and they just decided to supply less. That'll cover it. All right, part C. Alternatively, suppose the government wants to close the gap by fiscal policy. Well, we just kind of talked about it a little bit. Identify a fiscal policy action the government could implement to close the gap. All right, hot economy, we need to close this. Fiscal policy. This is just good overall review. You can never see this too many times. Fiscal versus monetary. Okay, remember, 5 total tools. We've got government and taxation. Monetary, we've got reserve ratio, discount rate, open market operations. So what can we do to close this? If we need to decrease aggregate demand to close that gap, we could cut government spending, or we could increase taxes. One of those two would work. So identify fiscal policy action. We can go ahead and put both. We could do decrease government spending. Decrease government spending, or increase taxes. Now, by the way, the reason increasing taxes work is when you increase taxes, that leads to a decrease in consumption. So remember, we all know that AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. So we're trying to decrease any of those. So decrease directly government spending or increase taxes to decrease consumption. So that was C1. All right, now C2. How will the fiscal policy action identified in part C1 affect the following? So what happens if you decide to cut all these? Well, remember, this says we're above full employment. We have a lot of people working. And so what's it going to do to the unemployment rate? Well, if we cool off the economy back to normal, it's definitely going to increase it. But it will increase it back to full. It'll still be at a good place. And then what happens to the natural rate of unemployment? Well, remember, this is at full employment, and if we were thinking Phillips curve, I'm going to put it here just for the sake of space here. The natural rate of unemployment does not change. So we're just going to say no change. Natural rate of unemployment is going to stay put. Okay? Or no, sorry, that was just still part of 2. Increase for the first part, and I'll just put comma, no change to natural rate of unemployment. And I'll put increase on unemployment rate. No change to NRU. Okay, so now we are at 3. 3 says, in closing the output gap, will automatic adjustment identified in part B1 produce a higher, lower, or same level price level? Really good question. So let's go ahead. I'll make a little sketch right here. Okay, and we'll contrast these two. This is not going to be a super detailed sketch, but it's important to address this. So here is the difference in the approaches here. So I'm going to draw two situations where we have an economy in an inflationary gap. Okay, so the question is, what happens as we fix these? Okay, so if we decide to intervene and we say, hey, let's cut taxes, or let's raise taxes, cut government spending, we are attacking the aggregate demand curve, and it would bring this back. Okay, now when we bring this back, I want you guys to look. We are going from here, and we are bringing this back to here. And what I want you guys to notice is how the price level went lower. Okay, so the price level was definitely lower when we moved the aggregate demand curve. Versus look at what happens here if we do nothing and let aggregate demand go. Well, if aggregate demand goes back, it goes up here. And aggregate supply. Aggregate supply curve moves back and it goes up to here, to even higher price level. So you guys can see pretty clearly, if we're moving the aggregate demand back, it's moving price level down. If we move aggregate supply, it's moving price level up. And that's what they're wanting you to differentiate, these 2 points right here. So what it says is, in closing the output gap, will the automatic adjustment identified in part B1, well, part B1 was this one, the short-run aggregate supply curve, moving, doing nothing. This one, self-correcting, SROS. Will that produce a higher, a lower, or the same level, price level, compared to what we would do here? So they're saying which one is higher. If we do this one, it's clearly a higher price level. And that's just being able to read the graph. Higher price level. Okay. Now, part D says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the market for loanable funds. So now we've got to make some room for that. Loanable funds market and show the effect of the policy action. Okay, so let's see if we can make enough room for the loanable funds market. And I just realized on this one, I think there's two approaches to this. I'm just going to move this over a little bit, make these a little bit smaller, because you actually could answer this two different ways. So we'll do one loanable funds market here, and we'll move another one here. I think one of them makes much more sense, but technically there's two answers to this question. All right, so we have our loanable funds market. I'll just address this one first. It says, so show what happens to the market for loanable funds, show the effect of this fiscal policy action identified in C1. So it's a little bit, you got to keep track of your work here. Now in C1, it was a decrease of government spending or an increasing in taxes. So what they're wanting you to conclude here, and this is, I don't know, maybe a little bit vague. So we're going to label everything here. Quantity of loanable funds, demand for loans, supply of loans, and this is real interest rates. Okay. Move this over a little bit. So here's what they're wanting you to conclude here. Well, if we're going to cut government spending, we're not going to be going to the loanable funds market to support our fiscal policy. There will be no demand for loanable funds because we're cutting government spending. Or not no demand, but there'll be no government demand. So we will actually have a decrease in demand. So you could say, oh, well, that decrease in demand here is going to result in our interest rates dropping. And boy, does the AP love this dynamic. What happens when interest rates drop? Now, you could have interpreted it that way. Now, the other way you could have looked at this, you could have said, well, instead of reading it that way, which I think this is the way most people would answer this, but there are some people that look at it this way, and you're going to see you get the same answer either way. Instead of having a decrease in demand, what some people would say is that because the government wasn't coming to borrow this, we had an increase in supply, and it pulled down the interest rates anyway. I'm not a huge fan of this approach, but if that made more sense to you, that's fine. I like this one, that there was a decrease in demand and it pulled it down. But in either case, you can see the interest rates went down. But I think this is better. So it says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the market for loanable funds. Show the effect of fiscal policy action identified in part C1 on the equilibrium of real interest rates. Decrease in demand drops it. Okay, and so then in part E says, given the interest rate change identified in part D, will long-run aggregate supply shift to the right? Okay, again, guys, I'm going to draw this again. I'm going to erase it. But it's so important that you get the difference here. What happens, and I'll just do this from equilibrium. What happens when the catalyst is an increase in investment versus what happens if it's just an increase in consumption or government spending? So it's so important that you have this down. Okay, so I'm not even going to label all my curves, but if it's an increase in government spending or consumption, we have an increase in aggregate demand, which is true. So we go from A and we go to B. But this triggering of inflation and price level right here is going to result in SROS coming back. And so although those go this way, SROS comes back because of increased prices, and we just have inflationary bubbles. That's what happens. But when investment is the thing that's driving aggregate demand, yes, there is an increase in aggregate demand, and price level does go up a little bit. But the humongous difference is when it's businesses expanding and businesses building new buildings and new restaurants and new factories and new facilities, although there's a slight uptick in price level, they're increasing the ability to supply more things. So what happens is, yes, there's an increase in aggregate demand, but it's followed up by an increase in supply capabilities. And what winds up happening is we go over here and we have a new LROS that comes through there. I know I haven't labeled everything, but what happens is my long-run aggregate supply increases as the economy gets bigger. Remember, businesses build economies. Businesses, entrepreneurs, investment, that is what builds economies. Okay? And with building economies, that's where it employs people, that enables consumers to have a paycheck in order to go to the marketplace as well. So, are they all a factor? Yes, but this is the big one. This is what grows an economy, not this one. Okay? So what they're saying is, what's the thing that drives investment? It's low interest rates. That is one of the key principles to learn out of macro. And so you just want to say, what's going to happen to long-run aggregate supply? You go, oh, low interest rates. And the shorthand is, oh, well, low interest rates lead to an increase in investment. An increase in investment leads to an increase in aggregate demand. That increase in aggregate demand driven by investment is going to lead to an increase in short-run aggregate supply, which is going to lead to an increase in long-run aggregate supply. Okay, that's the domino effect. If you wanted, you could insert real GDP into there. But to answer it very quickly, there's this phrase they love whenever you're investing, you're increasing capital formation. So I'm just going to say a decrease in interest rates leads to an increase in investment. And that's the investment word, the I of CIGNX, leads to an increase in investment and creation of capital formation. And I actually didn't even address the first part of the question. It says, given what will happen to the long run, and I'll just say this now, LROS shifts right. Okay, should have said that first. LROS shifts right, get that point, and then explain. Okay? And that is question number 1. Seems pretty typical. You just get an inflationary gap and addressing the multiple ways to fix it, which is do nothing, which was one of the topics, and then also intervene by cutting government spending or taxing, which was No, C1 was that one. Okay, so that was fiscal policy. Then loanable funds market, etc. And this is the biggie, you guys. This is the huge, huge one. Whether it's loanable funds market or monetary policy, when interest rates lower, what happens? Investment, which grows aggregate demand, aggregate supply, longer aggregate supply grows an economy. Okay, so there it is, question number 1. Let's move on to number 2. All right, question number 2 is a foreign exchange question on the 2019 set 2, and Forex is not going to be covered on the 2020 exam, so we can move on to question number 3. Question number 3 jumps right out at you that this is a trade table of sorts, and so we're probably going to have questions about comparative advantage, absolute advantage, and maybe some PPF stuff, so we'll have to see. So here's what it says. Sweden and Norway. Wow, I'm impressed. They actually used country names instead of X and Y. Sweden and Norway use equal quantities of resources to produce food and capital goods. The table shows the maximum possible production of food or capital goods for each country. So this actually is a production, it's an output. And so it was a little tricky at first. It says they use equal quantities of resources. So if it would have said different amounts of resources, it would have been an input. But it's the same amount of resources to produce these things. So we have food and capital goods. And right away, you're thinking, well, it's a little bit different. It's not like food and like roller skates or something. It's just a general category of capital goods compared to food. But it is a trade table, so we might as well just go ahead and figure out all the things we're going to need. So it's an output question, and we'll just have them here ready to go. So I redrew this here, and I put our numbers to the side so we can put in our per unit opportunity cost. So since it's an output question, our other good goes over. So 100 over 50 is 2, so it is going to be 1 food, and I use an equal sign. You can use a 4 or costs, whatever you want. So I say 1 food is equal to 2 capital goods, which means I'm going to have the reciprocal of that here. So 1 capital good is equal to 1/2 of food. Then on this one, other goes over again. 1 food is equal to 4 capital goods, because I have 120 over 30. And then over here, I'm going to have 1 capital good is equal to 1/4 of a food. So it looks like, as far as absolute advantage for food, it would be Sweden. For capital goods, it would be Norway. But as far as comparative advantage, Sweden has it in food, Norway has it in capital goods. So we'll, actually I think we can go ahead and circle those. So those are going to be our comparative advantage winners, and we'll see what those questions come up. All right, so part A says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the production possibilities curve for Sweden. Place food on the horizontal axis, capital goods on the vertical. Plot the relevant numerical values on the graph. Okay, so let's see. I guess we have room to do that here. So let's build that graph. So, oops. It says in the problem, it says the horizontal is food on the horizontal, so we'll put that one here. I'll put this way over here. This is food, which is going to make this capital goods. And since we're doing a country, when you're doing trade tables, I highly recommend just use what would look like constant opportunity cost. That's what they're looking for. Don't think you'd be penalized for it being increasing opportunity cost, but we tend to stick with constant on these. So plot the relevant numbers. So we have capital goods, and so our capital goods for Sweden was 100. So we can just pick a point on here. Right there. I'll try to make this a little bit to scale. So there's 100, and then for food for Sweden is only 50. I'll make it a little closer. And looks like we just have that. Could have made this a little shorter, obviously. So I'll move that there. Okay. So not a huge skill, maybe just neatness here. Clean this up. Definitely err on the side of as neat as possible, though more important to finish if you're pressed for time, but whenever possible, try to clean it up and make it neat. So I guess that's all we need to do, plot the relevant values. Then for part B, it says go to this thing, and now it says on your graph in part A, indicate the following. A point that represents an efficient level of production. Well, any point along the curve is going to be productively efficient, so any point you want, just take that and label it as E. So we have that. Part 2 says a point that represents an inefficient level of production labeled as I. Well, anything inside here will quark, and so we'll call that I. Then it says a point that represents unatable levels of production. Anything outside here, and that would be U. So, not super difficult, but just got to know your stuff here in vocab and location, so pretty nice, A and B. Let's move on to part C. C says, assume Sweden moves from producing 20 units of food and 60 units of capital goods. So I'm going to jot that down. So this is independent of the data on the graph, so that was a little bit confusing here. But it says let's get a new set of info here. So let's pretend Sweden, so this is for C. Let's pretend Sweden does the following. It says 20 food and 60 capital goods. Okay, so they're going to do this, and it says they're going to move from producing this much to doing this much. It says they're going to increase this to 30 units of food, and they're going to decrease their capital goods to 40. And then it says, what will happen to the economic growth of Sweden for this future, in the future? Well, here's what they're testing you on here. They're testing you to see if you know the importance or the difference between a capital good versus a consumer good. And so if you remember earlier in the year, there was always this contrast, doesn't matter which one you put where, it's the principle here, that if you put capital goods here, we'll say, and you put consumer goods here, well, any point along here is productively efficient, but the more you invest in a capital good, you want to be down here as far as possible. So, in fact, I think what I want to do, just to go over this little lesson here, this is an easy thing to miss earlier in the year, because actually this kind of comes up before in the overlap time between when you're first learning econ in general, and sometimes you're not really ready for this to sink in. So let's, for both of these, I'm going to put consumer goods on the bottom. Okay, consumer goods. And on the vertical axis, I'm going to put capital goods. So I just switched that up here, okay? So capital goods, okay? And now we have two countries, okay? And let's say this country decides to have this combination of goods or of resources going toward capital goods versus consumer, and this country down here does this much. So what you want to notice, I'll put an A here for both, what you want to notice is that this country is spending way more money on capital goods. This country is spending way more money on consumer goods. Well, what are the consequences to spending on capital goods? Well, if you're spending on capital goods, you're investing in the capital that's going to enable you to grow. So the consequences of this one is you will have much more explosive economic growth, something more like this. This is what happens when you invest in capital. But if you just buy a lot of stuff, your economy will still grow, but you're going to grow much more conservatively, something more like that. Okay? This is the lesson they were trying to drill on here. So, in Sweden, what happens if they decide to reduce how much they're going to spend on capital goods, but increase what they spend on food? What's going to happen to their economy? Very straightforward. The economy will, there's two ways to say this. You could say it will grow more slowly, so maybe it still grows just at a slower rate, or it may actually contract. Okay? That's what they're testing you on. Do you know the difference here? So if you missed that, again, this was easy to miss this early on, and so this could be a simple example of this is a society that spends more money going shopping at Fashion Island, whereas this is a country that spends more money building fashion islands. And ultimately, what's going to happen? Well, you could have 20 fashion islands, which would result in explosive growth, assuming there's the demand for it. But if everybody just stays at Fashion Island, it's like, well, the one fashion island's going to be doing well, and maybe they'll expand, but that's it. So it's the importance of investing in capital. And that's actually another one of the reasons why Hong Kong had such explosive growth. All right, let's move on to D. D says, which country has a comparative advantage in the production of capital goods? Explain. Well, I guess now we can come back to here. The capital goods one was this one, and so that was Norway. So Norway, get your point for saying the right country, and then explain Norway has a lower opportunity cost. And you could actually say 1/4 is less than a half. That's how we determined that. Okay. Then part E. Part E says, based on the table, identify a specific number of units of capital goods that could be traded for 10 units of food and be mutually beneficial. All right. So let's look at this. If you remember, there was the strategy about finding a mutually beneficial terms of trade. So I'm going to do it for this one. If you wanted to be mutually beneficial, I would say, well, that's going to be one capital good for any number F for food that is less than a half but greater than a quarter. Okay, so if you remember, you just had to pick a number that was in between the opportunity cost to be beneficial. Now over here, you would say, well, I would do one food for any number that's less than 4. So I'm going to say a capital good that was less than 4 but greater than 2. Okay, and so I'm looking to go in between. All right, so on this particular question, they don't make this very easy. They say 10 units of 10 units of food. So for us, this would have been easy. It would have been easy if you could have just come up with one. It would have been easy if you would have just been able to go, oh, well, I'll just look at this. You could have just said, oh, one food for, I mean, the number's jumping right out at you. You'd pick 3. One food for 3 capital goods. Or you could come over here and 1/3's jumping out at you again. And you could say, oh, I'll do one capital good for 1/3 of a food. Those would be easy. Those are fitting right in, but you're not allowed to do that because they give you a condition here on 10. Okay, so this would be easy if we could do it that way, but we can't. So let me show you the trick. It says, how many units of capital goods could be traded for 10 units of food? I'm going to show you the easy way to do this if they do it this way. What I'm going to do is flip it around. And I'm just going to say, okay, so you're telling me I've got 10 units of food for, I don't know how much capital goods. Okay, now because we have the trade table set up, this works. Don't worry about it. Having this 10 here, they're saying how many capital goods for 10, it just looks goofy. So what you want to do is just set it up like this. So this is step 1. Then step 2, just divide everything by 10. So I'm going to divide this by 10, and I'm going to say, oh, well, this is one food for, by the way, I'm going to just make this x, because I don't know what it is. I'm going to divide that by 10 capital goods. So there's my setup. One food for x over 10 capital goods. All right? And then here is step 3. I have the rule. I have to have any number between 2 and 4 would work. So one food for any number between 2 and 4. One food. So I'm just going to put x over 10 in here. So I'm going to say, oh, well, it's x over 10. That number has to be less than 4 or greater than 2. And I got that from my work over here. All right, and now all I'm going to do is just get rid of the 10, multiply both sides by 10. 20 is less than x is less than 40. So any number between 20 and 40 would work. So your pick, 25, 30. So you guys could kind of see that number 3 was jumping out at us. So 3, 1/3, and now 30 is kind of a nice friendly number here. So I'm going to say, based on the what capital goods can be traded for 10 units of food, 30. So E, my answer will be 30 capital goods. So you don't have to solve the inequality. I just did this to show you could pick any number in there. So if you wanted to play guess and check or do whatever you wanted, there is another way to do this where you could say you could have taken this thing right here and multiplied both sides by 10, and you get 10 capital goods, multiplied both sides by so I want to do 20. Yeah, multiply both sides by 20, and you get 20 capital goods for 10 food. And then over here, you multiply both sides by 40, you get 40 capital goods for 10 food, and you said to pick a number that fit between there again, and you would get between 20 and 40. You get it that way too. But I figure this way makes kind of the most sense. If they do that to you, just divide it and still see where it fits. Okay, so a little trade table, a little PPF, understanding capital goods versus consumer goods. So that was question number 3. So for 2019, set 2, we only had 1 and 3 because 2 was not in the curriculum this year. All right, so there you go. Thanks for watching, guys. We will see you next time.